Hi there. Welcome back to the Shaman Circle. I'm your host, AB, and today we are talking about building a sacred space, what it means to make your home a safe home base for your energetic practice. Now, as we dive in today, I think it's important for us to first define what safety even means. When we talk about creating a safe and sacred space, we're talking about psychological safety, emotional safety, spiritual safety, and physical safety. So to me, safety means, or having a safe environment, means having a safe environment that I can physically, emotionally, and creatively express myself in without fear of judgment. So you can decide if you want to run with that definition as we move through the concept of safety today, or if there's a different definition that resonates with you. Totally up to you, my friend. You are in charge of what your practice looks like, including what your space looks like and what the concept of safety is to you. So please know, as we move through all of these podcast episodes, you are always in charge. You are the master of your life, and I am simply here to help guide you along the way. So now that we know what kind of safety we're talking about, I then start to question, what does it even mean? Or how do I even know when I've stepped into a sacred space? And when I ask that question out loud, what comes to mind immediately is Notre Dame in Paris. And I had the privilege of traveling there with my family when I was younger, maybe like 12 or 13. This was before the huge fire that they had had. And I remember stepping in and just being welcomed with this presence of respect, of reverence. There was just this deep presence there that I, even now to this day, 2 decades later, I still can't necessarily put into words. But you felt it, and you knew that it was a sacred space. I remember there being candles lit everywhere. I remember there being incense, this concept of fire and purification. And I specifically remember, as loud as it was outside, when you stepped into that cathedral, it was quiet. There was a deep reverence there. That's the word that keeps coming up the more that I talk. There was just a deep reverence in the safety of that space. So as we move through today, is there any space in your life that, when I say sacred space, immediately comes up for you? Maybe that can give you some clues as to how you want to create your own space moving forward. Now, I want to pause here and say we're talking about creating a safe space for us to practice our spiritual work in. Now, we have this course called Rooted, where we create an ancestor altar, which the altar itself is the sacred space. We're not going to dive too deep into that. This is more generally, how can we make our room, our apartment, our house, whatever spaces we're occupying, how we can make those more generally safe for us to practice in and more sacred for us to practice in, versus specifically creating a corner of a room to devote to our ancestors or our lineage. Like, those are kind of two separate conversations. We're starting to toe the line with both of them. They are in alignment. They are adjacent to each other. But I do want to make the distinction that, when we talk about, in this episode, creating and building a sacred space, we're talking about our space generally and not one specific table of remembrance. Now, I'm sure many of us have heard this saying that we are a product of our environment. And as much as I believe that, I do also believe that our environment is a product of us. So we just wrapped up, a conversation about self-love in our last episode. The concept of creating a safe space outside of us, one could reason, starts with the safety we create inside of ourselves. If we don't have a foundation of, psychological safety and trust with ourselves first, it can be a little harder to create that type of energy outside of us. So just something to keep in mind, whether you're moving through this podcast or you're physically, literally creating a space along with me. Oftentimes, the safety and the sacredness we're looking for in a physical space outside of us, that safety is going to start from within first. So although they are two very different conversations, building a sacred space does absolutely coincide with creating a safe space for yourself within yourself first. I realized in my own spiritual journey pretty quickly after I embarked on that self-love journey of I'm open to the idea of loving myself into, no, I actually do love myself. I was pretty early on in that journey where I realized I needed a dedicated space for my spiritual work. And that was at the time I had moved back home from Philly. I was living with my parents. The pandemic just hit, and I was very lovingly set some real boundaries of like, hey, like I love you guys a lot. So grateful that we get to share space. And my room, like my ancestor altar is being built in there. I'm practicing my tarot cards in there. Like I need my room to be mine. And I'm very grateful that my parents, as much as they could, understood that and respected that boundary. So I realized very early on, like April 2020, that I needed to be intentional with the way I took up space physically in my energetic and spiritual work. Now, when we're talking about this concept of creating a sacred space, right? What does that mean? Well, it's not just decorating a room. It's funny as I say that out loud, it's like, it's not decorating a room, it's decorating a room with intention. But that is essentially what building a sacred space is. It is creating the space with intention, with respect, with devotion. You know, those things, consistently showing up in that space, that matters more than the physical materials you use. Although the physical materials you bring into that space can surely be important as well. So what makes a space feel energetically safe? And how can we personally create that safety? Well, I think that comes back to what is your definition of safety, right? I can answer that for myself, knowing that creating a safe space means being in a space where I can express myself freely. That's how I know that I'll be in a space that is energetically safe, is when my energy feels free to be expressed. Maybe that looks a little different for you, right? How do I personally create that safety? This has taken years of practice, but I no longer walk into spaces where I can't express myself freely. You're not going to find me at a bar trying to be cool and social. You're not going to find me in spaces where, you know, people talk behind your back, but you still have to show up to keep up with the Joneses. Like those spaces just aren't for me anymore. And to be honest with you, that took a couple years of emotional and spiritual maturity to be able to walk away from spaces that I knew weren't energetically safe for me, but still like my ego wanted to be a part of them. So building this safe space and choosing whether or not to enter spaces in some ways does come down to emotional maturity. And that is something that we learn as we continue on with this practice. Now, there are some ways that we can tell when our home or when our space needs some extra attention, some energetic maintenance, some clearing, some cleansing, some grounding. I mean, first and foremost, if you don't feel good in your space, right? Like if you walk in your house and you're like, oh, ugh. Like that's a very clear sign that something is misaligned. And that can be as intense as it just not being the right space for you. You've outgrown it and it would behoove you to move. Or it can be as simple as I got to open the window and sage some shit because there's just some stagnant energy in here. Right? So there are many different ways that we can clean, cleanse, ground, maintain that sacred space. Now, what that sacred space even looks like, again, is completely up to you. But once we find ourselves in there, we can sage it with sage. We can use Palo Santo. We can use other herbs to bring in different energies. Opening up the window if you have a deck or a porch and you have a screen door, literally just letting the breeze in can help literally refresh the air in your space. Depending on what you think is needed, whether that is a clearing or you need to cleanse the space or you yourself need to ground into the space. You know, there are different meditations, different breath work, different types of energy work that can be done to complement that intention. sound is a really beautiful way to cleanse your space. You don't need to have a full, 7-bowl chakra crystal singing bowl set, but if you have a little chime or you've got a tiny bell, like bringing sound in can help cleanse the energy and cleanse the air in your space. So there's a lot of different ways, depending on your intentions, depending on your spiritual practice, there are many different ways to maintain that sacred space once it's created. You can also use different tools, right? Like a sacred space, or I should say a space is immediately sacred to me when there is the presence of an ancestor altar. Like if I'm in the presence of someone's lineage, how could that not be a sacred space? But that's just my perception of it. You're welcome to have your own, right? And this can be an opportunity for you to toy with that, to play with that, try on a new perspective, see what it feels like. We can also use different tools, candles, crystals, herbs that I had mentioned. We can have those meaningful objects. Like, yes, the intention of the sacred space can be more important than those physical material objects, and also we live in the material world. So those materials do hold value and do hold meaning as well. If someone doesn't have too much space or too much privacy, the first thing I would tell you to focus on is to create as small of a space as you need to that is yours. Depending on the intensity of the lack of privacy you have, that could be a literal lockbox. You can have a locked safe in your room or in your space where you have your sacred items. You've got your Palo Santo, you've got a picture of your grandma, you've got a necklace that means something, whatever those sacred items are for you, you can quite literally keep them locked in a safe in your room, and with the intention, we have that safe space there. So I recognize that that's a bit of an intense example, but I share that to say, no matter what circumstances you may find yourself in, there's always somewhere to start. Even if creating that sacred space is in your mind first, in your body first, before it's ever a physical space that you go to. Now, I recognize this is a relatively short episode, one, because we have an entire course of how to create a sacred space within your altar, but also because the concept of a creative space or a sacred space is going to look different for every human being. What I think might feel psychologically safe to me may look very different to you. And so I want to give you some pointers, some guidance, some wisdom, but ultimately creating and building that sacred space and what that looks like and what that feels like is going to be up to you. So building a sacred space means building a safe space, which means defining what safety even means to you. What types of safety are very valuable in this chapter of your life? In what ways do you need to keep yourself safe? In what ways do you expect to be safe in your space? We understand the concept of a sacred space. It's not just decorating. It's not putting up cute wallpaper and a couple photos over there. And we got this little trinket from Home Goods, right? Like those can all be meaningful. But what is the intention that we're setting with this space? What energy are we asking to bring into this space? We know how we can maintain that space once we have it created. We can clear it. We can smudge our space. We can bring in new energy with meditation. We can literally open the door or open the window and bring in fresh air, right? We know a couple different ways of how to maintain that space. And we know that no matter what kind of space we're working with, we can start somewhere. So my friends, I think I'm going to leave you with that. If you already have a sacred space that you feel safe sharing with us, or if this has inspired you to create that space or bring that intention into your current space, reach out, send us an email, send me a DM on Instagram. I would love to hear what this sparks for you. If you're open to it, would love to see what your spaces look like. And I think the last thing I'm going to share here, if I could leave our listeners today with one simple way to begin, start small and stay consistent. That could be as small as, if you're in decent weather, opening the window for 30 seconds a day, simply to clear out stagnant energy and to bring in fresh. Like if you did that every day, every other day, or a consistent time that made sense to you, if you opened your window or your door intentionally, that could be really powerful. That in theory could be enough to maintain that space, right? But I just want to leave you with, do something small. Start small, stay consistent, and continue to show up for your space, just as your space shows up for you. So I will leave you with that, my friends. A quick how-to, a quick rundown, a crash course of how to build a sacred space where you can practice your energetic practice, Reiki practice, tarot, your self-love practice, right? Whatever it is that you are working on in your healing era, I hope this gives you some ideas of how you can create a space that prioritizes that. So thank you so much. I hope you have a beautiful day. Again, if you feel called, share your spaces with us. I would love to see them. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the other side.